Welcome to another episode of What's Your Everest? I'm your host, Carla Steingraber, sport and performance psychologist, author, speaker, and coach. Today, I'm really excited to welcome Kristen Jacobsen. Kristen is a licensed clinical professional counselor, also an author and therapist who specializes in helping individuals understand the deeper patterns that shape their thoughts, emotions, relationships, and behaviors. Her work focuses on the powerful role that the subconscious core beliefs play in our lives and how those beliefs often drive self sabotaging patterns that keep us stuck. Kristen is the author of Unpacked: How to Detach from the Subconscious Beliefs That Are Sabotaging Your Life. It's a great book that helps readers uncover the hidden beliefs formed through impactful life experiences, understand how those beliefs continue to influence adulthood, and develop practical strategies for creating lasting change. Through a combination of clinical insight, relatable examples, and actionable exercises, Kristen provides readers with a roadmap to greater self awareness, healing, and personal growth. Kristen, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to diving into these topics more with you because so many people struggle with patterns like this that they just don't fully understand. And
Mhm.
your book offers powerful framework for helping us make sense of where those patterns come from and what we can do about them. So welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to write Unpacked and why did you feel now was the right time for this message?
Yeah, so I I would say my sort of life's purpose is using my own experiences with anxiety and trauma to help others heal from theirs. So that's kind of why I became a therapist in the first place. And then, I've been working with clients for over 15 years, and I just really started seeing patterns in the way people were thinking. And most often they dated back to childhood. So
Yeah.
a lot of times we'll have certain beliefs about worth, value, maybe feelings of inadequacy or a fear of failure or things like that that were sort of planted in childhood unknowingly. We just absorb these from what's modeled, what our interpretation of things, and then we carry those into adulthood, and they can manifest as perfectionism or imposter syndrome or procrastination,
Yeah.
lots of different sort of self-sabotaging types of behaviors.
And how did you otherwise become interested in that deep relationship between core beliefs and behaviors? And I know you mentioned perfectionism and
Mhm.
procrastination, and these are things that so many people deal with on a regular basis.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what I notice is that a lot of times people are just sort of managing the symptoms and scratching the surface of what's going on. So, we can find ways to manage anxiety, for example, or certain strategies that we can use to help with perfectionism and not getting stuck there, but we're not actually addressing the core issue. And so that's what I got really interested in, is like, how do we address the root so that we can actually heal these things and release them, as opposed to just continuing to try to manage them day to day.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the deep, deep work of psychotherapy that's very different from just using kind of band-aid strategies.
Mhm.
What you're both a therapist and a human being who shares parts of your own story in this book. What
Mhm.
was it like for you writing such a personal book?
Yeah, it was very vulnerable and kind of challenging to put myself out there, but I also know that there needed to be a piece of like humanness and relatability
Mm,
and authenticity there, that I didn't want to just be sort of the expert or the teacher. I wanted readers to know that, like, I'm not only speaking from professional experience, I'm also speaking from personal experience, and so I'm sort of coming at it from both angles, and hopefully that resonated with them and allowed them to just connect with some of what I was sharing a little bit more.
yeah, I thought you also did a really nice job of pointing out that there are experiences that are not necessarily major traumas. I mean, they
Mhm,
might have been um, emotionally impactful. They might have been, traumatic without it being a volcano exploding. And
mhm,
those things also shape our core beliefs. People often are dismissive, like, oh, they did their best, or oh, it was I had everything was fine,
mhm.
nothing really happened. Can you say a little bit more about these differences and how people can start to understand those impacts as well?
Yeah, those impactful experiences are sort of, well, they can be isolated incidents that just, had an impact on sort of how we saw ourselves or the world or other people. But a lot of times it's just the repetition in sort of messaging, or the
Yeah,
repetition of sort of how we interpret things growing up. And that's what sort of gets internalized for us. And so it's not a matter of like blaming your parents, or, saying that you had a horrible childhood, or anything
right,
like this. Like, a lot of the clients I work with would say objectively they had a good childhood, but a
right,
lot of times parents just were incapable of meeting our emotional needs, not through anything intentional or malicious, but just because of their own, flaws, or setbacks, or things that are unhealed within themselves, that they weren't necessarily able to meet their child's emotional needs. And so now it's a matter of taking ownership and accountability of those things for yourself, not being a victim, not blaming your parents, but rather getting curious about how those things affected you and what you can do about them now.
what is your experience with that? Often I find that when people first start working with me, that they're
Yeah.
almost resistant to that kind of curiosity. So how do you deal with those situations?
Yeah, I really encourage people to look at things through the lens of curiosity versus judgment. I think so often we are, even with ourselves or the different parts of ourselves, even some of these self-sabotaging behaviors, we're very quick to judge these things. And if we can make that shift into really seeking to understand and get curious about them, then it's a lot easier to heal them, or to just kind of address them, and accept that these are in existence, whether we like it or not.
Yeah,
But there is a lot of grief in recognizing that a parent can't meet your needs, right? I think we all would love for to have an ideal parent, um, and a lot of times when we recognize that, okay, our parents are human too. They have
yeah,
flaws, they have shortcomings, they have their own traumas that they've been through. Um, and so it's sort of, um, we can recognize it without assigning blame. We
yeah,
can just look at it from a place of understanding, and kind of compassion for them too, that like they were doing the best they could.
yeah, yeah. Most people are, even if it wasn't good in the moment, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you have two people like siblings who are there for the same event, but they walk away with really different beliefs from the event.
Oh yeah.
Why does that happen?
Yeah, again, it goes back it's almost like less about what happens objectively in a situation, and more about our interpretation of it,
Mm,
and sort of
yeah,
the imprint that it makes on us. So I think it's really about how each of those siblings interpreted the event. One person may have felt completely out of control and helpless, whereas the other person may have um sort of jumped into action, and did something in the moment, or whatnot. So I think there are so many variables at play in terms
mhm,
of how we interpret a situation, and it's different from person to person.
yeah, yeah. What are some of those most common core beliefs that you run into in your practice?
Um, I think most common has to do with our sense of worth or value. So
Mm,
it's not like people are walking around thinking I'm worthless. And that, that speaks to the subconscious nature of them. But when we kind of dig deep, that's often what is at the core is like this
Yeah.
fear that they only have value or worth if they're performing, if they're achieving, if
Yeah.
they're useful, if they're helpful. Another big one is that like feeling like you're responsible for everything. Um, a lot of the high achievers I work with, whether they were old as children or just had a lot of pressure put on them growing up, that's another big belief that I see often. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that too. This sort of I'm not good enough or I must not have been enough if
Yeah.
this and that happened. How does that kind of a belief kind of quietly influence decisions and relationships and even opportunities that people have or seize years later?
I think a lot of times people will seek out external validation for that. So if they're internally feeling like they're not enough or inadequate in some capacity, they will look to others to um, sort of test that, right? And so it's constantly sort of working for that external validation that you are enough or you did achieve something or you did accomplish something versus it being more internal and sort of that sense of intrinsic worth and that internal validation, which is a much more steady foundation. Then it's like the
Hmm.
external. It's nice to have. It always feels great to get a compliment or those accolades, but it doesn't make or break us, right? It's not the roller coaster of okay, if we get that external validation, then we feel good. But if we're not getting it, or if we get criticized or constructive criticism, that it's not going to sort of break us.
It's interesting because you actually see this frequently with athletes, right? Because they get
Mhm.
so goal oriented and outcome focused. And even
Yeah.
today's educational system is so outcome
Yeah.
focused,
Mhm.
where there's a pressure to kind of win or perform at all costs.
Mhm.
So people do then engage in a lot of behavior that might be unhealthy or not quite legal or kosher or whatever,
Yeah.
and it's really a shame because then that outcome, the trophy, the A, the 4.0 or 5.0, whatever it might be, is put into this place of being so much more validating than their effort
Mhm.
and what they're working towards and what it means to them. um and you talk about this in your book that our subconscious acts as a filter.
Mhm.
How can somebody start to recognize that they're actually reacting to the present versus reacting to an old wound?
I think to just kind of gain self-awareness and kind of again get curious, ask themselves questions of if a feeling or a thought comes up like okay, why? What is this trying to tell me? What is this trying to communicate to me? Instead of a lot of times our thoughts will be so automatic that we don't even pay attention to them or we'll dismiss them if something um if like an uncomfortable thought comes up, but these things are all sort of messengers and can give us some good insight into what might be attached to the past and what actually is about the present moment. And a lot of times, if we are so outcome oriented, it's like we're looking for that achievement to provide evidence of that worth, and then we get it, but it doesn't. It has that effect for a little bit, but then
Yeah.
it wears off, and it's on to the next, right? The novelty of it wears off, and so I think really focusing on like the effort and what qualities or characteristics you possess that got you to that outcome, like are you hardworking, are you determined,
Yeah.
are you,
Hmm.
all of these things that are more personality driven versus outcome driven, something external.
Yeah, there are a couple of interesting examples. Michael Phelps. I don't know if you saw his documentary of The Weight of Gold, where he talks
Yeah.
about getting all those gold medals, and he's got that day of excitement, and the next day he's like, oh. 4 more years,
Yeah.
just the weight of what now and what do you do and how exhausting that is. Or even Andre Agassi, too, where he makes it to the top and kind of totally burns out because
Yeah.
he was doing it all for his father instead of for himself. And
Yeah.
his struggle of really internalizing it and doing it for himself. Now,
Mhm.
those are really sort of extreme examples, but what are some examples of benign childhood experiences that have surprisingly powerful long-term effects?
Yeah, so one example, I was actually watching a video with Dick Schwartz, who's the creator of Internal Family Systems, and then another therapist the other day. And she shared an experience from her childhood. Well, actually, it was her teenage years, where I guess she was a runner and she went to the shoe store with her mom and picked out a pair of sneakers. And her mom was like, "Oh, those are too expensive." And she was, I believe, the oldest of seven. And so, again, a very benign experience, right? Something that, like, if you looked at it objectively, it's like, oh, okay, the mom is teaching her good money management skills,
Yeah,
right? Like, we can't just buy anything. But she interpreted that as, like, she has to go without. She has to be selfless and sort of sacrifice what she needs so that everyone else can be okay. And so
yeah,
that followed her into adulthood and really kind of impacted how she is in relationships or how she um, meets her own needs, difficulty setting boundaries or saying no to people. So that's just one example of how it's like so, these are things we would never ever pay attention to, but it's not
right.
until you like actually kind of get that awareness and start asking yourself those questions of like, I wonder why I feel like this, where could what feels familiar about this? Something like that.
It really underscores how children interpret things so differently from adults. I mean, a funny example is we were once on a road trip when I was young, and my father was driving and drinking a Sprite, and my brother said to him, "I thought you're not supposed to drink and drive." And so the interpretations of children can be so concrete.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and we as adults, and even sometimes adult to adult, we use language very flexibly in a very different kind of way. And not everybody understands it the same way. Is there any advice you have for parents, coaches, teachers, leaders, how what we need to understand in terms of that difference in how children sometimes understand what we're trying to tell them?
Yeah, I think for starters, understanding that intention is very different than impact. So
Yeah.
a lot of times people will say, "Oh, well, I didn't mean it that way," or "I intended it or I intended it to, you know, mean this," or that's what I was trying to say, and that wasn't the impact that the other person received. Not saying there's a right or a wrong on either side. It's just the recognition that sometimes how we intend something to land for another person is not how they interpret it at all or receive it. And so I think just um with relationships and in parenting, just making sure those lines of communication are open, because it's not like you're going to check with your child every time, like, okay, what, did you understand that the way that I intended it?
Yeah.
But I think you can check for a degree of understanding, but also just making sure that there's that trust there, that open communication, that if they are confused about something.
Reacting badly, right?
Yeah,
What do you
exactly.
think I'm trying to tell you right now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right.
Well, and that term self-sabotage, we use it often. Not everybody fully understands what it means. How do you use it?
Um, I think of it as behaviors that um sort of limit us in some capacity, and we don't necessarily know why we're doing them. We might think we do, but oftentimes there is a subconscious driver to that. And so we're actually limiting our success, our happiness, our contentment a lot because these beliefs have such a hold on us. They're like, um 90% responsible for what we do. We think we're doing everything consciously, but that's not the case at all. And so I think just, recognizing what is maybe um standing in the way of you trying to be the person you want to be, or do the things you want to be or do, I mean, and what might be behind that.
Now, you've pointed out in your book that some forms of self-sabotage look really productive,
Yeah.
and I've certainly had people defend overworking, even overachieving.
Yeah.
Uh, Say a little bit more about these hidden forms of self-sabotage that look so good on the surface.
Those are the hardest ones, right? The ones that are, like, socially reinforced, and,
Yeah,
some of these things probably did make people successful, right? It's
yeah,
just that
sure.
in an extreme form, they start to become self-limiting or self-sabotaging, right? So if you're striving for greatness, and you're very goal oriented, that probably made you pretty successful. But if everything has to be perfect or you're a
Yeah,
failure, that's not a healthy way to operate or live, and you're kind of constantly setting yourself up for disappointment. So it's sort of finding that balance between, okay, I have these qualities that have really helped me, but now maybe I'm in a different environment or a different situation. And if these things are in an extreme form, they're actually starting to hurt me in some
yeah.
capacity.
Yeah, and I think a big thing is the inflexibility of it too, is
Yeah.
that, when maybe the perfectionism first started, there was a different level of expectation than when
Hmm.
they've gotten further along, and perfect looks way different. And they
Hmm.
also don't have the ability to pick and choose the situation so easily. It might be every test, every paper,
Yeah.
and um at some point you just burn out. You're reducing how much mental space you have available to perform
Right.
well
Right.
across the board.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What have you found? There are a lot of people, even intelligent people, capable people, who keep repeating the same painful patterns.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
So I like to frame it as like they're trying to use a cognitive solution to an emotional problem. Not that it's a
Yeah.
problem, but
The
something
logical to
that's
deal with the
limiting.
psychological
um,
doesn't work.
yeah, so like you can have insight into these patterns, you can understand them, but if there's something in your nervous system or in your subconscious that is stuck, then you're not fully going to be able to kind of work through those shifts on your own. So I think it can take a little bit more um guidance, or more sort of that mind body connection, so to speak, to really kind of work through some of these things.
And we have these emotional blind spots. How come they're so
Mhm.
difficult to see in ourselves?
Yeah, again, I think it just goes back to the subconscious, right? Our blind spot. And that's the thing, everybody has them. It's not like, there are people walking around here who are even the most
They're
self-actualized.
perfect.
Like, yeah,
they're,
like,
they're perfect people who don't have any blind spots.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
everybody has them, so it's just a matter of, how impactful yours are, and it's like we can get a lot of insight into those blind spots and create change. That was sort of the goal of my book, but there can be times where we just can't access that. We need somebody else to kind of help us work through those blind spots, and to see them in us, and sort of call them out, in a compassionate way.
Yeah. And do you see a lot of people intellectualizing their emotions?
Oh yeah, that's probably the bulk of the clients I work with are,
I think I feel upset about this,
yeah.
right? Or how do you feel? I think it's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you help, how would you help listeners recognize that they're thinking about their emotions rather than actually feeling them?
Yeah, I think if you have a hard time connecting it to a body sensation, then you're probably intellectualizing it. So, take for
Mm,
anxiety, for example. Like a lot of times people will feel that in their stomach, it'll feel like a pit, or they'll feel it in their chest. And so I find that a lot of the clients that are very cut off from their emotions and very much live in their heads, they'll have a really hard time locating like where emotions live in their
yeah.
bodies. Mhm.
Yeah. And people have different thresholds,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So, one theme that really stood out was that difference between surviving and thriving. How do
Mhm.
survival patterns show up in adulthood?
It's sort of the either the fight or flight response or the shutdown response. If we are sort of living in alignment with who we want to be and our values, we'll feel very safe, we'll feel connected to other people, we'll be able to be very present focused. But when we're living is sort of in those survival patterns, our nervous system is either going to be amped up or shut down. And so I think if there's a lot of um y- a lot of like with fight or flight, there can be a lot of anger and frustration, or a lot of anxiety and panic. And then with the shutdown, it's very a lot of detachment, or sort of depressive feelings. So I think just kind of noticing those is really important.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes some of these coping strategies, they stop being effective. How
Mhm.
could people start to really notice that there's been a breakdown in the effectiveness of coping strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the discomfort or the distress that they experience is an indication that something isn't working, right?
Hmm.
So, um, oftentimes, I think people will reach out to us once that becomes almost like too loud, right? That
Yeah,
distress or that discomfort becomes too loud. But if you can sort of um again, going back to that, just kind of like being self-aware, taking the time to check in with yourself to see how you're feeling, how things are going, and um whether you feel like you're living in alignment with who you want to be, and what you want to be doing. And if not, then you know that something is needs to be adjusted.
yeah,
I think part of it is that, society kind of tells us that that's wrong in a way, right? It's like don't brag, don't promote
yeah,
yourself, don't be cocky, don't be like overly self-centered. And so I think sometimes we take that to mean that like we shouldn't give ourselves any validation, right? Like
right.
we don't want
Yeah,
to be those things. But I think it's important that, we don't need to do that in an external way. In fact, when we do, that's indicative of insecurity in and of itself, right? When we have to brag or be boastful or arrogant, right? That points
right.
to insecurity. But just being able to um like really celebrate and be proud of who you are, and what you do, and to take the time to validate yourself in those ways in private, right? Just like this is just
Hmm.
for you and your own well-being. It has nothing to do with anybody else.
Took a lot of work, so you're happy with the result, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think so many people downplay compliments or negate them in some way. That's one thing I work with a lot of my clients on, is like when you get a compliment, just say thank you. Like leave it at that.
Right.
You don't have to add anything in, or it's like just let it be. Take it at
Yeah,
face value. They'll minimize themselves because it's not as good as so and so, right? They're not to that level, or so and
I
so is
see.
better, and things like that. So I think I see it more sort of in that
Yeah.
capacity. Yeah.
Yeah. As they say, comparison is a thief of joy,
Yeah.
right? How do you know with your clients when you're genuinely changing a core belief versus just intellectually understanding it? Or how would they know?
I think it's one of those things where like you look back in reflection and you can see the change. It's not something that it's like happens overnight, or you wake up one day and you're like, yeah, this is great. I feel like everything's better. It's more gradual, it's more experiential. When we're learning, we can consume information and sort of have that intellectual understanding or that insight, but it's more when we have those experiences and our nervous system sort of learns safety through those experiences that, like, okay, I can put myself out there and maybe I'm fearful of judgment, but I did it anyway and my world didn't
Yeah.
collapse.
Yeah.
Things like that where it's more looking back on those experiences and things just start to feel easier. And that you're
Yeah.
sort of internalizing that new belief system. I know it can sound a little hokey to people and
Mhm.
um like, "Oh, just have self-compassion," But
Yeah.
I know it's not that easy, but it really does change things because a lot of, I think, the issues that people struggle with are because of self-judgment,
Yeah.
and sort of minimizing their own needs, their own accomplishments, who they are, their worth, all of that stuff. Yeah.
Is there an exercise in your book that you wish everybody would try?
Oh, I don't know if there's one in particular. Maybe the one about, I can't remember what chapter it's in, but I talk a lot about through the internal family systems lens of we all have parts. And so a lot of these,
The good part and the bad part?
yeah, well, there's
Just kidding.
there are no bad parts. That's the
Just
thing.
kidding.
Yeah. But that a lot of these like self-sabotaging behaviors are actually just protective parts of us. And
Yeah.
once we can get to know them, understand them, and have compassion for them, they tend to ease off a little bit. Just I see my clients really, really kind of stepping into their value and worth without needing that constant validation from other people. And
Oh, wow.
with
Yeah.
that, there's like a ripple effect, right? Because it's like if that's the root and we're healing that root, that belief, everything else changes, as opposed to like trying to change a million different things on the surface. And so
Yeah.
that's what I really try to focus on with clients is like, all right, well, once we shift the root, then everything else will kind of fall into place.
Yeah.
I had a client yesterday and he's like, this is the I've never felt better than this in my entire life. And like just
Yeah.
hearing things like that, I'm like, yes,
If listeners remember one message from Unpacked, what would you want that message to be?
that any any of this self-sabotage or anything, any of these challenges they're running into are purely survival mechanisms, right? They're just protective parts that are trying to keep you safe from whatever it is, failure, feeling inadequate, whatever kind of that root is. And so we don't want to judge them with those things. We don't want to push them away. We want to explore them and get to understand them. And I think just having that shift from like judgment to curiosity and compassion is so powerful.
How do we avoid passing on these unresolved issues to our children?
Oh gosh, I battle with that every day. It's like I know too much, and so now I'm like constantly like vigilant about how I'm parenting. But I think like just being curious about this stuff and wanting to learn it kind of means that you won't do these things to mess up your kids, right? It's the ones that don't have any interest in this and are just like going about their lives like not trying to learn and grow themselves. Like they're the ones that are inadvertently going to pass these things on. But I think if you are working on yourself, that trickles down to your kids. And again, a
Mhm.
lot of it is their interpretation. It's not something that we can necessarily control. But if we have a good relationship with our kids and we leave those lines of communication open, then any obstacles or misunderstandings or struggles, they'll feel comfortable enough to come talk to us.
Yeah, really having those conversations with children, even asking them sometimes for feedback.
Yeah, and I think to make sure they feel like respected and heard. Like sometimes my 5-year-old will call me out on things and I'm like, you're absolutely right. Like I shouldn't have done that. Or, I said
Yeah.
this and I did this. Like you're absolutely right, and just to kind
Yeah.
of like model that accountability. Mm.
Yeah, and also being willing to apologize,
Yeah.
that's a big one.
My website, which is catharticspacecounseling.com, it has links to my book. It has links if people want to schedule a consultation and work with me, and it has all my social links in the footer of that page. So that's probably the best way.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Great. And lastly, I like to ask everyone on the show, what's your Everest? What's on the horizon? What's your next big goal?
Oh, that's a good question. I would really like to do more public speaking, booking some bigger. I've done some in the past, but like booking some bigger jobs there.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you.